All right, let's talk about something we hear all the time in politics: left and right. I mean, they're everywhere, right? We use them to label politicians, parties, whole ways of thinking. But have you ever really stopped and thought, what do these words actually mean?
On the surface, it seems pretty straightforward, but the more you look into it, the more you realize it's kind of messy. We throw these labels around so casually, we just assume we all know what we're talking about. But as you're about to find out, the real story is way more surprising.
And look, in most democracies today, we have a general feel for it. You hear left, you probably think about things like social welfare and government programs. You hear right, and your mind goes to free markets, less government, law and order. It's the modern political shorthand we all use. But what if I told you that all of those definitions are actually pretty new, and that the origin of left and right had absolutely nothing to do with economics or taxes or any of that? The real story is, well, it's a fascinating accident.
So let's go all the way back to the beginning. These terms weren't born out of some grand genius philosophical debate. Nope, it was much simpler than that. It literally just came down to where people happened to sit in a room.
Picture this. The year is 1790. We're in France, right in the thick of the French Revolution. And inside the French Constituent Assembly, the future of politics was being shaped, not just by ideas, but by the actual seating chart. Over on the left side of the hall sat a group called the Jacobins, and these guys were not messing around. They weren't just reformers, they were full-on radicals. They wanted to tear down the entire system, get rid of the monarchy, and build a totally new, more equal republic from the ground up. And on the right, the Girondins. You can think of them as the conservatives of the day. They weren't totally against change, but they wanted to pump the brakes, keep the monarchy, and take things much, much slower. So right from the start, the blueprint was simple. Left meant radical change, and right meant preserving the way things were. But of course, those original meanings didn't stick. As the world changed, the labels had to change too. The big political fights shifted over and over, and the terms left and right just sort of stretched and morphed to fit whatever the new argument was about. And you can really see that evolution here. It started in the 1790s as revolution versus monarchy. Then, the Industrial Revolution kicks in, and by the mid-1800s, the big fight is about socialism versus capitalism. Jump to the 20th century, and the Cold War makes it all about communism versus anti-communism, which brings us to today, where the main event is usually framed as liberal versus conservative. And this is where things get a little ironic. Today's left, or liberals, they're often not trying to overthrow capitalism anymore. They're trying to work within it to make it fairer, with things like Social Security and progressive taxes. Meanwhile, the modern right, or conservatives, who are all about a free market, are often the ones demanding the government use its power to enforce a specific moral code. The meanings have gotten all tangled up. And this is where the whole system really starts to break down. Because as handy as these labels can be, they're often just way too simple for the real world. So many huge political movements just refuse to fit neatly into one of those two boxes. I mean, just think about fascism. The automatic response for most of us is to label it far right. But when you actually start to pull it apart and look at the pieces, the picture gets a whole lot blurrier. This is where that simple binary just completely fails. Fascism actually borrowed ideas from what we now call the left. It used populist ideas and big social programs to get people on board. But at its core, it was also super nationalistic, run by elites, and brutally authoritarian, all things we'd associate with the right. It just doesn't fit on one side. It's a weird hybrid. This isn't just about fascism either. The same weird paradox applies to populism. As one historian put it so well, a populist leader could be attacked for being a right-wing reactionary and a left-wing radical. And in some situations, both accusations would be totally on the money. And don't think for a second this is just some European thing. We've got a perfect example of this political messiness right in American history, the progressive movement in the early 20th century. On the one hand, the progressives were pushing for all sorts of social welfare programs that we would definitely call left-wing today. But, and this is a big but, a lot of their motivation came from a reactionary fear of immigrants and the changing modern world. And let's not forget, they supported prohibition, a massive authoritarian attempt to enforce a moral code on everyone, something you'd normally peg as a right-wing impulse. So, okay, the labels are messy. We've established that. But it actually gets even stranger. The source material for this explainer is a huge 2-volume encyclopedia. One book is called The Left. The other is The Right. And what's inside is honestly mind-bending. Get this, some of the most famous people and most important ideas in history are so complicated that they are literally listed in both books. They're so impossible to categorize that the experts just threw up their hands and put them on both sides of the spectrum. And the most incredible example of this? Abraham Lincoln. Yes, that Abraham Lincoln. He is listed as a major figure in the Encyclopedia of the Left, and he is also listed as a major figure in the Encyclopedia of the Right. His legacy is just too big and too complex to be crammed into a single box.
And he's not the only one. The encyclopedias also list Zionism, the very idea of protesting, and even feminism under both the left and the right. It just goes to show you how fluid and contested these concepts really are.
And the list of things that mess up the spectrum just goes on and on. I mean, how do you classify nationalism? Or what about ethnic separatist movements, like the Basques in Spain, who were left-leaning but allied against the fascist right? Even single issues like abortion get tricky because both sides frame their arguments using the language of right. So, after all of that, what are we supposed to think? Well, it's pretty clear the left/right spectrum is not a perfect system, not even close. But that doesn't mean it's totally useless. We just have to be smart about how we use it. We have to understand what it is, and more importantly, what it isn't. So, let's wrap this up. What are the big takeaways? First, the whole left/right thing started completely by accident. Second, the meanings have been changing constantly for over 200 years. Third, they're often massive oversimplifications that hide more than they explain. And finally, and this is the key, we should think of them as a tool. They're a starting point for a conversation, not the final word. Which really leaves us with one last really important question. If left and right are just clumsy shortcuts, then how can we find a better, more accurate way to understand the political world around us? What other tools can we use to make sense of all this complexity? Now that's something we're thinking about.